Good evening. It's not working?
No.
Well, we'll have to deal with that before we start, because we want to hear our speakers. Yeah. Can you help us? I'm sorry, just a moment. We'll see if we can fix this.
It's warming here, isn't it?
Oh, but it does. Is that not working? You can't. It's a little better. Okay. Okay, well, I think we'll have to. Can I be heard? Yeah. The subject of this evening's symposium is a subject with a question: a new anti-Semitism, the case of Great Britain. And before I introduce the two participants in this symposium, a few words of introduction which I think are useful to place into a broader perspective any discussion about anti-Semitism at the present time in a particular place. As we all know, anti-Semitism belongs to the genre of xenophobias in the world. But it is a very specific xenophobia, an archetypal case of the genre. It is a protean phenomenon. It can be likened to a virus, and at root it is a cultural phenomenon. It's a protean phenomenon in the sense that it's ubiquitous, has extraordinary longevity, and expresses itself in an infinite variety of forms and a wide range of degrees of severity. And it's like a virus because it's capable of infinite mutations. And as I've said, most historians agree, I think, in the final analysis, it is cultural. That is to say, the root of the syndrome underlying all its psychological, social, economic, and political causes is a matter, in the final analysis, of stereotypical symbols inhering within the culture. Indeed, the defamatory symbols depicting Jews are so deeply ingrained, almost inextricably embedded in Western-rooted cultures, and now also in Islamic cultures, that, as we know, there are many examples of anti-Semitism without Jews. That is to say, there can be no actual Jews present in a given society, and yet there can be hostility showing all the traditional expressions and forms towards Jews. Just as it was already endemic in British culture in Shakespeare's time, in the 16th century, even though the Jews had been expelled from Britain in 1290, at the end of the 13th century, that is. The historical process has been a truly vicious circle, because these negative cultural symbols have been constantly applied in practice. In turn, they constantly reinforce the cultural symbols themselves, adding layer after layer of prejudice and stereotyping. Generation after generation, for over 2,000 years at least, some argue much longer, this vicious circle has exponentially generated culture-bound hostility to Jews. This is why it seems to me, at any rate, that one of the profoundest types of definition of anti-Semitism is hostility towards or hatred of Jews predicated on the culture-rooted bigotry which posits that evil inheres in the very nature of Jews and everything associated with them. Now, this being so, what does this signify for the question being posed here this evening? A new anti-Semitism in the case of Great Britain? In what sense can one then speak of it being new at all? Surely one can only ask no more than, does it constitute a new layer, a new convergence of factors, a new rationale? In short, a new mutation, but surely can it be something really radically different from its essential nature throughout all the centuries of Jew hatred in the past? And specifically in the case of Britain, is it overwhelmingly only the instrument of Muslim hostility towards Israel in a country which has about 1.5 million Muslims? Or is there a new legitimacy for anti-Semitism perhaps in the British public discourse? Is it a new prominence amongst certain intellectual elites, in which case, which intellectual elites? Is there a convergence of the liberal left intelligentsia with Muslim hatred and the neo-fascist right? Or do they all have their separate expressions and paths to this manifestations of anti-Semitism? Well, these are the kind of questions, I think, that have to be addressed if we wish to seriously engage ourselves in the topic of this evening's symposium. And I have no doubt that the two participants in the symposium will enlighten us greatly in relation to these and many other questions that I haven't posed. I have great pleasure in introducing to you Brenda Katten, who has just returned, I understand, from leading the WIZO delegation to the United Nations Annual Commission on the Status of Women Conference held at the United Nations in New York. She has represented both the State of Israel and WIZO at numerous UN meetings, including an invidious task, I think, the UN Conference Against Racism held in Durban in South Africa in 2001, which, as we all know, turned into a vicious anti-Semitic fest. She represented the State of Israel to the Women Defending Peace Conference held in Geneva in 2004 under the co-chairmanship of Mrs. Mubarak. And in January of this year, she was elected to the position of chairperson of the Israel, Britain and the Commonwealth Association. She is something of an anomaly because she was the president of the Zionist Federation of Great Britain and actually came to live in Israel. And I understand she was the first woman to chair the Zionist Federation of Great Britain and Ireland, and also the B'nai Brit Hillel Foundation. So you see, this is a person who has a great deal of experience, not only coming from Britain, but as a leader in the Jewish community and as a representative of Jews in environments that are very much related to the subject of this evening's symposium. So I would like to ask you, please, to deliver your talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Shimoni. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Erev Tov. You can't hear me? Oh, is that better? Is that okay? No? Speak close. Is that better? Okay, fine. It is a great privilege for me to be here tonight and to share this platform with two such eminent professors as Professor Wistrich and Professor Shimoni. I think to start with, I would like to analyze what do we mean by anti-Semitism. And I think it also depends on the baseline from which we come. For example, recently in the United Kingdom, Tony Lehrman, who heads the Institute for Jewish Policy Research at the UK, made it quite clear that in his view there was a distinct line between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, anti-Israelism. Well, I would like to start off by saying that from my baseline, there is absolutely no distinction between the two. And I'm going to explain why I feel this way. Anti-Semitism is against the individual. Anti-Israelism, anti-Zionism, is against the state of the Jews. Now, what I believe is that we only have to look back a few weeks when we heard the president of Iran, Ahmadinejad, say he wishes to wipe Israel off the map of the world. And then we refer to what the demographer, Sergio de la Pergola from this university, told us also quite recently, and that was within a very short space of time, the majority of Jews will be living in the state of Israel, Not because they all came on Aliyah, but basically because of the high rate of assimilation. And therefore, if you're going to wipe out the state of Israel, simultaneously you wipe out the majority of Jews in the world. February the 14th marked the 110th anniversary since Herzl wrote his Der Judenstaat. Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, was written as a means, the proposal was a means to end anti-Semitism. And here we are in 2006, all those years on, and we have a Jewish state that has been in existence for 57, almost 58 years. And yet what we see around us, and specifically in Europe, is a frightening rise of anti-Semitism. So Israel, in that respect, did not resolve the problem of anti-Semitism. Let's have a look at the statistics for anti-Semitic acts in Britain today. Well, it's rather a confusing picture, because if you look at the Community Security Trust, which is the Jewish group that tends to assess and guard the Jewish community, their figures are at odds with the Metropolitan Police figures. The Community Trust says it went down in 2005, but the police figures said it went up. And then when you read a little more carefully, you see that figures can be very confusing, because in looking at 2004, when they were slightly higher, there was a case of two gentlemen who made 60 abusive phone calls, and only 2 people made those phone calls, but they were considered 60 acts. The fact of the matter is, the more we read, the more we learn that it is on the increase, and many people simply do not report on any anti-Semitic act they've experienced until it's happened perhaps for the 35th time. From where is anti-Semitism coming? It doesn't at this moment in Britain come specifically from the British National Party, the right. More and more we have seen in Britain and in Europe an increase coming from the left. And what do I mean, the left? I mean the media, I mean politicians, I mean the world of academia. And of course it is coming from a large Muslim population. In my view, however, and I will go on to explain why, the area that I feel most anxious about is the academic area. And I say that because it is from the universities that we get the leadership for tomorrow, throughout the world, and certainly for the Jewish community. I want to speak a little bit now about the United Nations, because I believe the United Nations is responsible to a very great extent for the increase in anti-Semitism today. 60 years of the United Nations, a United Nations that has spent much of its time demonizing, isolating and delegitimizing the State of Israel. Through its manifold resolutions, if you look at part of the United Nations, the Human Rights Commission, for example, has 2 committees. One committee looks at the way in which the world is carrying out abuses, the whole world, all the other countries. And there is one committee looking only at the so-called abuses carried out by the State of Israel. So that gives you an idea of the United Nations. The United Nations was responsible for the passing of that defamous resolution equating Zionism with racism in 1975. In March 2001, I went, as I have been going since 2000, to the United Nations annual meeting of the Commission of the Status of Women. March 2001, I would like to remind everybody, was a period in which we were having difficulties. We just, unfortunately, the actual peace process broke down. This 2001 session was to be in preparation for the so-called UN Anti-Racist Conference to be held at the end of August, the beginning of September in 2001. At this preparatory meeting in March, Much of the discussion related to the last regional preparatory meeting, which the United Nations decided would be held in Iran, in Tehran. That was a very good place to hold a meeting against racism. As a member of the Israeli delegation, I actually protested that this had been the decision, which meant the exclusion of every Jewish organization in participating in this last preparatory meeting covering the area of New Zealand, Australia, ourselves, etc. And of course, Israel could not participate. I did voice my concern on behalf of the Israeli delegation, and the lady from Iran, she responded by saying, this Zionist entity has no right to be here, it's murdering the women and children in Palestine, etc. You can imagine what she said. She couldn't even bring herself to use the word Israel. I thought that I was prepared for Durban. I had been warned what Durban would be like, and there is a connection with Britain that I'll come to shortly. As I entered the field where the first NGO conference was held, the non-governmental conference was held before the governmental conference, and we were able to participate in both. The non-governmental conference was held in a field, the cricket field of Durban, with many tents up. As I entered the first tent, I was confronted with a wall that was full of the most virulent anti-Semitic posters that would have done justice to Die Stürmer, and I do not exaggerate. Pictures of Jews with money next to them, pictures with Jews with dripping blood from their noses. But the worst poster of all was a picture of Hitler. Underneath it said, what were the good things that would have happened if I'd have won? The good things that would have happened is that there would be no state of Israel and no Palestinian blood would have been spilt. Now, is somebody going to tell me that is just an anti-Zionist declaration with a picture of Hitler saying that, or is that anti-Semitic? We in the Jewish caucus, and there were about 50 of us, protested to the UN authorities about these posters being on an official UN notice board. They were removed and they were put up again, time and time again. I was interviewed in the cricket field by the South African television, and I was a very interesting creature because of all the Jewish organizations, we were the only organization that had a Z in our name. We were the Women's International Zionist Organization. And the climate was very anti-Zionist, to put it mildly. So the interviewer starts interviewing me, and suddenly I'm surrounded by a hostile group of individuals, Black Panthers, Palestinians, Arabs, and he has to keep stopping and starting the interview. And the first thing he says to me is, how would you define Zionism? And I thought, here I am, what better can I do than quote Martin Luther King, who said, to be an anti-Zionist, my friend, is to be an anti-Semite. For how can we deny the right to the Jewish people to their own land if that is what we want for ourselves? And I was told, this isn't true, you're calling lies, what are you talking about? I learned a very bitter lesson on that occasion because I watched this program the following Sunday. It was not live, as you can imagine, and they completely distorted the actual interview, interspersed with others saying what they wanted to say, so it was completely distorted, and I would never do such an interview again. It had to be live. There was one Holocaust clause that we put in to the final charter that was to come out of this conference, this NGO conference. One clause on the Holocaust. This was supposed to be a conference against racism. We all came into the hall ready to see what would happen. Before that, we'd made up our mind that we'd walk out if there was going to be a big resolution against that was anti-Zionist. It never got to that point. When it came to the resolution on the Holocaust, it was voted on without any opportunity for any member of the Jewish caucus to stand up and say something against the idea of voting against the one clause that referred to the Holocaust in this so-called anti-racist conference. But I want to tell you now, about 2 weeks before I went to this conference, I was on Shlichut for Witzo. And the other gentleman that was there was a man by the name of Ory Davis. Some of you may know Ory Davis. Ory Davis was born in Kvar Shmariahu and spent most of his working life on the campuses of the UK. He was the bane of the Jewish student's life. Ory Davis, an Israeli and a Jew, was the flavor of the month in South Africa. He'd just written a book called Israel, the Apartheid State. So when I was asked to be interviewed 2 weeks before on the radio about women, I wasn't asked about women, I was asked again to define Zionism. And I was asked about Ory Davis. And how come this Israeli and this Jew has written a book about Israel, the Apartheid State? He's a Jew, he's Israeli, he must know what he's talking about. And along came Ory Davis to the conference handing out his book, an edited version of his book. Well, I told him what he could do with his book when he attempted to give it to me, and you can imagine what I said. But nevertheless, he did give out a number of books. The point I'm making is this man has been poisoning the minds of students in the UK from 70s onwards until he retired, which is only quite recently. This is the kind of problem that we are confronted with. Ory Davis is someone who talks about a one-state solution. What do we mean by a one-state solution? We mean the end of a Jewish state. Since that time, we have seen an increase of Jewish and Israeli academics who have joined the campaign to boycott the State of Israel. It started in England with a letter to The Guardian by two professors, Professor Stephen and Professor Hilary Rose, a husband and wife from the Open University, in which they called for the boycott of Israeli universities. April 2005, we saw on Erev Pesach, the timing is always very interesting, isn't it? The Association of University Teachers chose to have a resolution to boycott Israeli universities on Erev Pesach. And they voted to boycott Bar Ilan and Haifa University. And a gentleman who helped them with prepare the resolution was Ilan Pape, a lecturer at Haifa University. It was interesting at the time that two Palestinian professors from Al-Quds, Professor Nusseibeh and Professor Said Zadari, both called out against the boycott. But it passed at the Association of University Teachers, and it was eventually rescinded in May the 26th. However, it's not the end of the story, and I have many friends in the academic world in the UK who tell me it has not been resolved and it is constantly going to be a battle. About a year or so ago, there was a debate in the centre of London under the auspices of the Evening Standard called the subject of the debate, the motion was, Zionism is today's enemy of the Jews. That is another way of saying, very simply, if we did not have a Jewish state, we wouldn't have anti-Semitism. Well, of course, we know about that from Herzl's time, don't we? We never had any anti-Semitism before we had a Jewish state. What was very disturbing, in my eyes, is that the three proposers of the motion were all Jews and two of them were Israeli. We had Amira Hass from Haaretz. We had Avi Shlaim, the revisionist historian from here. And we had Professor Jacqueline Rose, who is a professor of English literature at London University. So, my dear friends, when you have three Jews, and two of them are Israelis and all academics, and they are saying to the world, Zionism is the enemy of the Jews, that's today's enemy, we have to start to look and see where our problems really are. Just a couple of weeks ago, Israel Apartheid Week took place at Oxford University. It also took place in Canada and many other campuses in the UK, but I want to stick with Oxford. It's a famous university. It's an important university. And who was the main person who was the star of the show there? Ilan Pape from Haifa. You know, I'd like to remind you, Ilan Pape accused Haifa of not being open enough or being anti-Arab. I think it's 20% of the students at Haifa University are Arabs. The head of one of the faculties is an Arab. Of all the universities in the state of Israel, I would say it is the most open and liberal, and has to be if it allows its Ilan Pape, who still lectures there, to go to Oxford, and he spoke on resisting apartheid, divestment and solidarity. That was his subject. And guess who chaired it that evening? And by the way, which evening did it take place? On a Friday night. That's a good time, isn't it? And the person who chaired it was Professor Stephen Rose, our friend who started the campaign with his wife with a letter to The Guardian. Also present at that particular week, the Apartheid Week, was the University of California's Professor Gabi Pitterberg, who is an Israeli anti-Zionist. And he was talking about Zionism and apartheid, divestment. So you see where we're coming from. You see where our problems really lie. As you heard in the introduction, I happened to have the honour of chairing the Hillel Foundation in the UK between 1994 and 98. Those were the days when we thought we were going to have peace. Those were the days we were in the middle of the Oslo peace process, and all of us thought we're on the right road to peace. Did it help our students at university? The answer is no. There was a constant challenge for our Jewish students. Time and time again, the universities, the Jewish societies on universities up and down the country, there were resolutions from Palestinian students, Muslim students, out to ban the Jewish society. And some of them succeeded, even if afterwards they were reinstated. Today, the biggest problem that our students have on campus in the UK is that they today are being asked to defend Israel's right to exist. We've gone right back to square one. And the tragedy is that for most of our Jewish students, and for most students per se, who are subjected to the daily barrage of media projection, anti-Israel projection, they are so vulnerable because they simply do not know the facts. They lack a solid education. They lack an education in what the facts are in their own history. And that is what is particularly frightening. How am I? Okay, still for time? Good. February the 2nd saw an inaugural meeting at Lord Richard Rogers, an architect, a famous architect, in his office, of an organization called Architects and Planners for Justice in Palestine. And you know who started it? I'll tell you. It was started by a man called Abe Chaim. Interesting. Abe Chaim was a Jew born in India. And he was brought up and educated and spent most of his life, his younger life, in Israel. He married a girl from South Africa, a Jewish girl, and then went to live in the UK, where he is an engineer. And he's the one who initiated this particular new organization. Well, as it so happens, Lord Rogers has now withdrawn because, basically, not because he probably changed his mind, but he was threatened with losing this wonderful new project that he was going to work on in New York if he didn't withdraw, because the people who were doing the project didn't agree with his policies. Let's have a look at the media. The press. I've mentioned the Evening Standard. The Independent. We hear an awful lot today about the Danish cartoon and how terrible it was, and I'm not one for saying that anyone should mock somebody else's religion. But I find it very strange when we looked at what happened with the Independent about a couple of years ago, when the Prime Minister, Sharon, was shown in a cartoon swallowing a Palestinian child, that if that wasn't bad enough, this cartoon won the Press Association's award for the year for cartoons. The Guardian that used to be, it was a pleasure for Zionists to read The Guardian when it was the Manchester Guardian. Today, we have a Chris McGreal who wrote about Israel and South Africa. He is the Israeli representative here to The Guardian. Previously, he was a South African representative full of apartheid. And he was endorsed, of course, by Ory Davis, who wrote a letter to The Guardian supporting everything he had to say. The BBC. The terminology is incredible. The terminology of the BBC. They don't talk about terrorists, they talk about insurgents or militants. Settlers, people are not human beings when they're murdered in cold blood, they are settlers. Recently, I was quite aghast because I watched a video on the BBC first and then on the Israeli television of an interview with Mohammed Deif, Hamas's Mohammed Deif. And Mohammed Deif, in this video, when I saw it on the BBC, he spoke about how Hamas had succeeded in driving Israel out of the territories. And that's all I saw. When I watched it on Israeli television, he spoke about how Hamas had driven the Israelis out of the territories, out of Gaza. And then he went on to say, and we will not be happy until we are back in Jerusalem, in Haifa, in Lod, etc. But that wasn't shown on the BBC. And I want to give you a personal example of the BBC and myself. When I was chairman of the Zionist Federation, it happened to be when they signed the Declaration of Principles on the White House lawn. We had Rabin and Peres and Arafat and standing on the White House lawn. And I was chairman of the ZF, and I was watching it, and I thought, right, this looks good. And I had a phone call from the BBC. Are you all the chairman of the BBC, of the Zionist Federation, not the BBC? And I said yes. Well, we are doing a live program on the radio in half an hour. What is your opinion of the signing of this document? How do you feel about it? I said, I feel very positive about it, as I'm sure the people of Israel feel positive. Women, mothers are tired of seeing their children die and being slaughtered, and we are looking for peace. And I'm very happy to see this declaration being signed. So the lady said to me, okay, we may come back to you in half an hour. I never heard another word from her. I turned on the radio in half an hour, and what did I hear? I heard the chairman of Cherut, who's a good friend of mine, speaking vociferously against the signing of the declaration, because that was the message that the BBC wanted to put out, obviously. They weren't interested in anyone who was saying that there was hope and that we really believed in peace. And I think that's very sad. Muslim population. Well, let's talk. How am I doing? Should I leave it for later, you think, or finish? Okay, I'll maybe have a second round. Let me just finish with a couple of points, and then I'll sit down. When I was in England, I was asked one day to take a group of Jewish students in a state school. This is a non-Jewish, ordinary state school, a group of 15-year-olds for a discussion on Israel and Jewish thoughts, etc. And I went along to this class, and I sat there with this group of teenagers. And it was around the time when many of the youngsters were gathering in Golders Green and Hampstead on Motzei Shabbat. And we started to speak, and they said, oh, we have people calling us all kinds of horrible names as we're waiting to meet each other, anti-Semitic names. And then they turned round to me, the majority of them, and they said, and you know what, we think it's our fault. We think it's our fault because the girls dress a bit loudly, and maybe we speak too loudly. And I was in absolute shock. The victims suddenly had become the perpetrators. And I can't help but wondering if this is one of the problems we are facing today in the world, in the academic world, with our professors who are so keen to distance themselves from the state of Israel. And I just want to finish with a quote of Melanie Phillips, who writes for the Daily Mail and the Jewish Chronicle. And she says this: the sport of Jew baiting has now become the vogue among the British media, which uses Jews to unleash the most blatant untruths and vicious lies and libels about Israel, so that the media can disavow any anti-Jewish prejudice on the grounds that Jews cannot be anti-Jewish. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think one of the particular advantages of hearing what you have said in this symposium is that you speak very much from the field, as it were, out there facing on so many occasions the very things that you have been talking about. At the same time, one must note that some of the things that you pointed out which focused very much on, firstly, anti-Israel activities, and secondly, the involvement of Jews in those activities, and in particular, the last quotation from Melanie Phillips and what you said at the end, linking them. These raise, I suppose, very serious analytical questions about the connection between what is presented as anti-Israel, associating Israel with apartheid South Africa and so on, and the phenomenon of anti-Semitism in its historic and broad sense. And I think that there's probably, there are very few people in a better position to look at the analytic aspects of this entire situation than the second participant in our symposium, who is Professor Robert Wistrich. For those, I think for many present here, there's no need to introduce Robert Wistrich. He has held the Neuberger Chair for Modern European and Jewish History at the Hebrew University since 1989. And in recent years, he has been also the director of the Vidal Sassoon International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism, which is the sponsor and organizer of this, amongst many symposia of this kind. And Robert has won many international awards for his academic excellence, including, for example, the Austrian State Prize for Danubian history for his book on the Jews of Vienna in the age of Franz Joseph. He also has done some prize-winning work in cinema. Particularly, he received an award for his book Anti-Semitism, The Longest Hatred, which became the basis for a 3-hour documentary film shown in Britain, which he co-edited and wrote the script for. He has also co-directed and scripted other documentary films dealing with anti-Semitism, such as Understanding the Holocaust in 1997, Obsession, Radical Islam in the West this year. He's a graduate of Cambridge University, and his most recent works include Masters and Victims, Jewish Fate in Central Europe, and he is about to produce a full-length study of contemporary anti-Semitism, which is near completion. So I need hardly add more to illustrate Robert Wistrich's great expertise and many achievements academically, and particularly on the subject of anti-Semitism. Robert, would you mind coming to the podium? Thank you.
Thank you, Gideon, for that introduction. Let me say that we do indeed try at the Vidal Sassoon Center to combine, where possible, the voices of experience and also the analysis of academic research. Because the subject of anti-Semitism, as I hardly need to explain here tonight, is not merely a theoretical or a historical endeavor. It is something that confronts the Jewish people, I would say, as a permanent challenge, and never more so than today. But I would like to wear tonight more my hat as a historian, and to look back, first of all, at two questions that seem to me particularly interesting, given the topic of tonight's discussion. The first is to establish what really was the old anti-Semitism before we rush to conclude that it is new. And secondly, to examine the degree to which there are distinctive characteristics of British anti-Semitism. There is one aspect which I frequently confronted in discussions of this topic, and also in the research, the historiography. The assumption that somehow British anti-Semitism was marginal, insignificant, not at all to be compared with the many continental varieties. Indeed, I would like to begin with a quote of none other than William Gladstone, who reportedly said in the 1870s, at a time when the first anti-Semitic movements were getting off the ground in Europe, he declared that anti-Jewish activities in Great Britain are as improbable as a demonstration against the law of gravity. I suspect that even as he pronounced those words, Gladstone was mistaken. Within 30 years, it was emphatically clear that this was not the case, and certainly at the beginning of the 21st century, we can say that this was an extraordinarily naive assumption. But when we speak about British or English anti-Semitism, I think we need to bear in mind that it is a very varied phenomenon. Historically speaking, and here is perhaps one of the paradoxes, the most virulent, the most radical, the most lethal form of anti-Semitism that existed in England was in the Middle Ages. And indeed, we could argue, obviously that's not the subject of tonight's discussion, but it has to be mentioned at least in passing. We could argue that in this respect, England was a pioneer for Europe, and not at all lagging behind. That indeed, in medieval England, you had a combination of factors which produced this violent form of anti-Semitism that combined blood libels, expropriation, and ultimately expulsion in 1290, as a result of which not a single Jew was left in the British Isles. And this anti-Semitism was the product of a predatory state, a persecutory church, and a violent populace. Very far removed from our conventional image of the British Isles and its great liberal parliamentary tradition. The second aspect of British anti-Semitism, which unlike the medieval variety, has very much survived to this day, something I was brought up on, since I spent 30 years of my life in Great Britain, and I went to an English grammar school, for which I'm grateful. That was before the miserable reforms introduced by the Labour Party, which wrecked the British educational system probably forever. As a result of that, I had to read all the leading authors in the English language, from Geoffrey Chaucer and his Canterbury Tales, through, of course, Marlowe and Shakespeare, Dickens as Oliver Twist, and the many 20th century writers, not one of whom was free of anti-Semitic stereotyping. It was something of a revelation to me, at the age of 16 and 17, to realize that every single author that I had to read for advanced level English literature, in fact, could have been described at the very least as contributing to the corpus of anti-Semitism, whatever their specific intentions. And that is one of the richest contributions, quote unquote, of England to the history of anti-Semitism. It's multi-layered and it runs deep. There is another kind of anti-Semitism, more banal, more everyday, what we normally call prejudice. Of course, prejudice is a base root of all forms of anti-Semitism. You encounter it in virtually all societies where Jews have existed, and in some, as was mentioned by Professor Shimoni, where Jews either never were present or no longer are to be found. England was a very good example, by the way. Following the expulsion in 1290, there were no Jews, or so it is said, until the time of Oliver Cromwell. Obviously, there were a few. But during this very long period of 350 years or so, the stereotypical image of the Jew survived and persisted. And that is what explains why Christopher Marlowe's The Jew of Malta in the late 16th century, not to mention Shylock, whatever we may think about Shakespeare's intentions, became such a powerful, resonant image. And again, another English contribution to the history of anti-Semitism. But the variety that we will be focusing on more, and which Brenda has spoken about at some length, is anti-Zionist anti-Semitism. And of course, it's a controversial issue. There is not a complete and total consensus, far from it. All of the Jewish anti-Zionists that you mentioned, who are so active today in Britain or other parts of the Western world, all of them would vehemently and indignantly reject the attempt to equate anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism. Nevertheless, the fact is, and this is part of the ongoing debate, and it didn't begin now, I can tell you that at a time when I was a student, and when I did my doctorate in Britain in the 1970s, I was also on the ground and going round campuses and having to deal with the issue then of whether or not anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And in practice, it was clear to me already then, at the time of the United Nations Resolution of 1975, with its consequences on British campuses, which I saw with my own eyes, the banning of Jewish societies, on the grounds that we can give no platform for racists. And since Zionists are racists, and they've been so defined by the United Nations, no right for Jewish societies to operate on British campuses. Eventually, we were able, with some help from important friends, to counter that offensive. But 30 years ago, all the seeds of the present development were there. And indeed, perhaps because of my experience in Britain and a certain sensitivity to this subject, I have to say that I could see the writing on the wall many years ago and wrote and said so. At the time, and this is the main difference between then and now, it was not mainstream. In Britain in the 1970s, for example, the leading lights in the anti-Zionist cum anti-Semitic campaign were either members of far-left organizations, particularly Trotskyists, among whom Jews were, as always, prominent, both as theoreticians and as propagandists, Palestinians, third world students who were already a growing presence on British campuses, and also young liberals. They were particularly in the 1970s very active in this field. A number of MPs who sit today in the British House of Commons, I remember from that period having debated them and how they graduated to become leaders of pro-Palestinian lobbies in the House of Commons. But before we launch into a full-fledged discussion of this, let's come back to the question of what is and is not distinctive about English anti-Semitism, perhaps I should say British, but I think we are actually speaking about English more than any other variety right now. First of all, I think as a generalization, it is fair to say that English anti-Semitism, excluding the medieval period, is and has been less ideological than the continental varieties that we are more familiar with in the literature. It has also been much less politically successful, that is obvious, in comparison with Germany, with Austria, with Poland, with Russia, with France, and so on. It has also, until more recently, in my view, lacked the obsessive element that characterizes so much of continental anti-Semitism, where it is ideologically driven. But I would suggest that today there is the beginning of a change, that there is something of that which can be felt in the anti-Zionist rhetoric and its obsessive, almost compulsive aspects among English intellectuals. So that perhaps for the first time, beyond some isolated cases which existed in the past, we are seeing England drawn perhaps into the broader sweep of Europe itself and coming to resemble more the continent, and in some ways perhaps even to lead in areas such as the boycott, for instance. If we look back approximately 100 years, it is interesting how certain events that didn't seem perhaps so important at the time can cast an interesting light on today. For instance, around 1900, the most contentious issue in Britain was the Boer War, in terms of foreign policy, in terms of imperial policy. It was the most contested episode in British imperial history of that era. And at that time, it was the left. This is generally forgotten, barely known, except for a handful of specialists. The left took the lead in an extraordinarily vitriolic campaign against the war in South Africa. If you read, as I did, the organ of the Social Democratic Federation in Britain, which was a Marxist organization, and its leader was an intellectual, a journalist called Henry Hindman, you see the most extraordinary attacks on the landlords, on the Jew financiers, on the Jew gang, cosmopolitan Jewish capitalists who have maneuvered and manipulated the British Empire into a disastrous war purely for the benefit of their own interests. I could go into great detail about that. We don't have the time for it here. What I want to say is that if you were to look back at those polemics, you would see some curious analogies with the way the Iraq War has been played out in Britain, and particularly the attacks coming from within New Labour against the British Prime Minister, who obviously is not an anti-Zionist and is certainly not an anti-Semite, and on the contrary is one probably of the better or the best friends that Israel has in the outside world, but whose stature, whose prestige has been severely damaged by the feeling, and I'm not going into the question of the Iraq War, yes or no, perhaps it was and is a disaster, perhaps indeed the critics are not entirely wrong. What I want to focus on is simply the use of the Jewish factor, both then and now, the assumption that a Jewish lobby, that a small group, a clique, a cabal of Jews around Mr. Blair, just as they were even more so influenced President Bush, that they plunged the West, the United States, and Great Britain into a disastrous war. Today, it would be said on behalf of Israel, then it would have been said on behalf of their own economic interests. Obviously, there is another strand of anti-Semitism in Britain through the 20th century, which comes from the right, particularly the conservative right, but also a radical right, less influential, far less so than on the continent, but nevertheless often underestimated, particularly when it comes to the acceptability or the legitimacy of anti-Semitism in British discourse. We forget today that a document like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was indeed given considerable credibility by that most august and prestigious and perhaps most important newspaper in the world at the time, the London Times. The paradox here is that it was the same London Times that ultimately, through its correspondent, Philip Graves, was to demonstrate in 1921 that the protocols were a forgery. But what is sometimes forgotten is that before that happened, the editorials in the Times seriously believed and argued that there was a Jewish world conspiracy, and speculated whether Britain had spent its blood and treasury through World War I to defeat Germany and a Pax Germanica only to fall under the heel of a Pax Judaica. We also forget that the effect, the impact of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia on British opinion, particularly on right-wing British opinion, but more widely, the way in which the fear of communism combined with fear of the Jews and a belief in Judeo-communism, which in many ways was no less tenacious than that which was held in Central and Eastern Europe. Again, the Times consistently wrote in this vein, as did the more right-wing newspapers like the Morning Post, the Daily Mail, Lord Northcliffe. Come back to the Daily Mail in relation to the present Mayor of London a little later. Bolshevism, the fear of Bolshevism, undoubtedly raised the Jewish question in Britain in ways that had not happened before then. This is reflected in Anglo Jewry. From 1920, it's clear that Anglo Jewry believes that it is facing a serious problem because communism, especially in Russia, is seen as being driven by Jewish revolutionaries, Jewish radicals. And they are engaged in a conspiracy to destroy the British Empire. Remember that in the period 1918-21, the British Empire for the first time shows signs of cracks. India, Egypt, Ireland, the Irish Troubles. The self-confidence of Britain, which I believe was one of the most important reasons why anti-Semitism did not achieve the same resonance in the 19th century as it did elsewhere, because Britain was the world's greatest power, because it ruled over so many peoples, a quarter of the globe. Why would they fear the Jews? They regarded the Jews as useful allies. They didn't have the same anti-capitalist sentiments that were so widespread in France and Germany and elsewhere among intellectuals. Or at least it didn't matter, because Britain itself, nobody in Britain could seriously be taken in by the proposition that the Jews had invented capitalism, or that they were behind the Industrial Revolution. I mean, the British knew they were the first industrial nation, and their own commercial and industrial enterprise had got off the ground well before Jews were a factor in Britain's economic life. But after the 1920s, I think that a lot of this changed. And some of the things that we see today are echoes, however pale, of the uncertainties and the suspicion, the distrust that does exist of Jews, something that I remember well from my own socialization in Britain. A word about Zionism in this context. In a way, the question of the British Mandate, which we can't really go into here, and particularly its unwinding in the last few years, 45 to 48, shows the deep ambivalence of Britain. On the one hand, the Balfour Declaration, what the British did in Palestine, but they did some good things. On the other hand, even among some of the architects and supporters of Zionism, there is this strange mixture of sentiment towards Jews. Lord Balfour, Scottish aristocrat, person who was fascinated by Jews, aware of their uniqueness, their singularity, something sadly lacking today in nevertheless was the same Balfour who was Conservative Prime Minister at the time of the Aliens Act of 1905, which severely restricted Jewish immigration to the British Isles. And the Anti-Aliens Act was a piece of anti-Semitic legislation, but typically English. You couldn't say, and the British never wanted to say, they were anti-Jew. Anti-alien, much more suitable to the English temperament, which is more moderate, which is more balanced, and which dislikes extremism. And this is still true to a degree. I'm not sure how true, but something of this still remains. Which explains why you find so many seemingly contradictory utterances among British statesmen, well-known English writers in the 20th century. Well, on the one hand, you see a dislike of Jews, a certain antipathy, a certain awareness of difference, quite strong sense of difference. And at the same time, a loathing for anti-Semitism, where it's associated, as obviously it was in the case of Nazi Germany, with brutality, with violence, with pogroms, because that's not the way we do things here. And that is very English. However, when we think of, just to say a word in passing, all the same about the mandate, about the end of the mandate, there is no doubt that among the officers in command in British forces here, whether it's Lieutenant General Barker or whether it's at a lower level of the Airborne Division, the sentiments were clearly, unmistakably anti-Jewish. And probably that was true among a section of the army and administration in Palestine from the beginning. So that you have, at one level, high politics, you have a much broader vision in which the Jews play a role. The Lloyd Georges, the Churchills, later Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair, are all, broadly speaking, pro-Zionist, pro-Israel. For my money, they were the outstanding prime ministers of Great Britain in the 20th century. But that may just be a coincidence, of course. But at the lower level, I think there was very little of that. And the stereotypical view of Jews was very important in shaping British attitudes towards Zionism and vice versa. We think today the question of anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism is so new. If you look at the literature, say, of the early 1920s, you see how the two things fused in Britain, admittedly among a different clientele. Then it was Lord Sydenham, and it was Lord Alfred Douglas, and it was Lord this and Lord that. You know, in the British upper classes, this was de rigueur, and they couldn't understand why Britain took on the mandate. This must have been a Jewish conspiracy. So these things are less new than they seem. So what then is new? Well, one thing which has been alluded to, but needs to be slightly more emphasized, is this strange alliance, almost contre nature, between the Islamists, the more radical wings of the Islamic movement in Britain today, and the hard left. I've said it before, it bears saying once more. There is so little that ought to be in common between these groups, whether it's the issue of secularism, the question of the emancipation of women. After all, this is International Women's Day, so we need to mention that when it comes to this question, which was always fundamental for the left, as indeed a certain attitude towards gays and other minorities, the Islamic attitude is well known and intransigent. And yet you have such strange comings together, strange couplings, as the Mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, Red Ken, inviting Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi in 2004 and rolling out the red carpet for Mr. Qaradawi as a great progressive, a man who's on record not only for many bigoted anti-Semitic utterances, but also homophobic and misogynist utterances of the kind you would not expect a man like Mr. Livingstone, who partly built his political career on sponsoring and supporting the causes of such minorities. You wouldn't expect him to be so eager to embrace. But then that's politics, opportunism, the growing importance of the Muslim electorate. It's also something more. We don't have time perhaps to go into it now. It's partly the multiculturalist trend, the fact that people like Livingstone and many others are proud, and to some extent with reason, are proud of the fact that London is a great multicultural metropolis with so many different groups, such diversity. But what has happened here is that in a strange way that would repay careful analysis, it turns out that multiculturalism that you might have expected is so good for the Jews may indeed prove to be bad. That the anti-racists, as I believe Mr. Livingstone is, a sincere and genuine anti-racist, and a sincere, genuine multiculturalist, can indeed hold views about Israel and be willing and even eager to offend the Anglo-Jewish community at every conceivable opportunity, while holding those same views. So here we see something that clearly is new, not merely a shift from the right to the left, but also from a sea change in attitudes to race and racism. Whereas in Britain, as in many other European countries, in the 1930s and 40s, racism, not necessarily in an ideological form, was a widespread view. And even Philo-Semites use this terminology. Today, it is anathema. It is the breaking of a politician to be accused, to have any hint of racism, or to use the fashionable misleading term Islamophobia to be attached to his name, and anti-Semitism too, which has led to another new aspect, and one which perhaps at this stage I will conclude on. Something very striking in the public discourse in Great Britain today, perhaps even more striking than anywhere else, although there are parallels in France and Germany. Today, precisely because anti-Semitism is considered to be a disastrous accusation for a person in public life to be tainted with, precisely because since the Shoah, it has become unthinkable to have any direct connection with events that led up to or are connected and associated with it. When Jewish organizations, the State of Israel, or non-Jews accuse a given individual, a group, a political tendency of anti-Semitism, it produces the most vehement, the most indignant, and furious responses. Are these responses to be taken at their face value? It seems to me there may be cases where this is so. There are also other cases where clearly one does protest too much. And even in the act of hitting back at those who make the accusation of anti-Semitism, the anti-Semitism comes out, if you see what I mean. Let me explain it then, because it is a bit convoluted, even perverse. The common assumption in the polemics that the last 3-4 years that I followed in Britain, this is particularly true of The Guardian, particularly true of The Independent, and a number of other papers and of intellectuals. If you say, for instance, Tom Paulin is a good illustration of this. Tom Paulin, as you may remember, an Oxford Don, professor of poetry, a poet himself, has his own program on the BBC. He wrote a notorious poem called Crossfire about the case of Muhammad al-Dura. I won't read it to you now, or the relevant lines, beyond saying that he brings out there not just his rage at the actions of the Israeli army, but much more than that. That we dumb goyim, he uses this phrase, we dumb goyim, we are being asked to believe that this innocent Palestinian child or adolescent died in the crossfire, but it was the Zionist SS who killed him. And then in a subsequent poem published in The Guardian, he talks about dealing the anti-Semitic card. And what happens among Britain's intelligentsia today is that if you raise the issue of anti-Semitism, what they will tell you, almost universally, a single universal chorus, is you are raising this issue with only one aim in mind, and that aim is to silence legitimate criticism of the State of Israel. And this is intolerable. And when I appeared before the Parliamentary Committee in the House of Commons less than a month ago, and was a very long discussion with very open-minded British MPs, this point still came up, and one could see that it was very difficult to try and communicate the idea that the question of anti-Semitism has nothing to do with the legitimacy of criticism of Israel. Because in the minds of so many people, in the elites in particular, I wouldn't say in popular opinion, but in the elites in Britain, there is this suspicion, if you're talking anti-Semitism, what you are really doing is trying to distance people from the real issue. It is a maneuver. It is the anti-Semitic card, as Tom Paulin presents it. And this is a particularly convoluted and subtle, and I think for the English mind, very appealing view, which we need to take into account. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Wistrich. Well, ladies and gentlemen, as you know, it always is advisable to be told when the session will come to an end, so that you don't get uncomfortable to leave. And I see that we have approximately 10 minutes, the most 15 minutes left, and I assure you then that we will close the session. So bear in mind that that's the time that's left before we end. There is an opportunity perhaps for a few comments, but given the time, I would appeal to you to be brief and please keep to the point of the discussion. I've noticed a few who would like to say something. I'll call upon.
Very brief. It's a fascinating subject and one could talk for a very long time. But just a few comments of fact. First of all, Ken Livingstone is being suspended from his job for 3 months, so we have some idea of the British attitude. Yes, all right, but he's still been suspended, which is not the usual thing for a mayor of London to have done to him. During the 1920s, Winston Churchill, no less than Winston Churchill was mentioned here, published an anti-Semitic article in the British press in which he condemned the Mali Jews, international Jews, Bolshevik Jews, all the Jews except for one category, which was the Zionist Jews, which, as you say correctly, at that time Britain was very pro-Zionist. On the actual question of British anti-Semitism and how unique it is, or how different it is, say, from continental or other anti-Semitism, we have a very recent example of the American Association of University Professors, which was going to have a conference, and in their bulletin or publication, they were going to publish an anti-Semitic Holocaust denial article. Now, immediately, this came to the attention of the three big foundations which support the AAUP conference. They withdrew the support, and immediately the AAUP withdrew the anti-Semitic Holocaust denying article. They still went ahead with the conference, but in a totally different manner. So these things are happening outside of Great Britain, very much so. And finally, just on the psychological issue of those people you mentioned who are Israelis, Jews, but they are anti-Israel and anti-Semitic, we have known about self-hatred of people who are constantly under attack, not all people, of course, but some people who are constantly under attack, constantly abused, constantly told that they're bad, and they identify with the aggressor, and they develop a bad self-image. We have a book on that by a very respected American scholar, Sandra Gilman, called Jewish Self-Hatred. We have another book recently called The Oslo Syndrome by Kenneth Levin, a Harvard psychiatrist, and I could name quite a few others. So this is a psychological phenomenon which is well known.
Thank you. Yes.
Yes, Professor Wistrich, you mentioned the anti-Semitic card. Now, next week, Honest Reporting is launching a UK site dedicated to dealing with the British media. Now, unfortunately, as much as I'd like to call a spade, we encourage our subscribers not to go around screaming anti-Semitism. Now, on a related point, we mentioned Ken Livingstone as well. I used to work at the Board of Deputies for my sins and had a number of scrapes with Red Ken. Now, I have a lot of sympathy for the board in their predicament, whereby they want to take action against Livingstone. They've taken action, and it seems in the PR battle to have backfired. Now, mentioning the anti-Semitic card, This is something which seems to be withdrawing our sort of the weapons at our disposal to fight anti-Semitism. How does the panel suggest that we try and regain the initiative on this aspect of the fight against anti-Semitism in Britain?
Thank you for your comment, but I must ask you to understand, I'm not going to ask the panelists to begin a discussion about what should be done about these things. That's beyond the scope of the present discussion. Yes.
I happened to be reading today about the murderous massacres in Germany in the Crusade period, and the similar things in England and New York and so forth. Has anyone tried to research whether today's anti-Semites are indeed descendants or just carrying on a deep, deep hatred and violence of ancestors from about 1,000 years ago?
Well, I think I'm going to save the panel again from answering that question. I don't think that that's a particular line of research that we're familiar with. Yes.
I just have a brief comment that both panelists missed completely the role of the British government in this whole enterprise. I once heard a British MP, a lady MP, speaking here in Jerusalem, and I wanted to ask her, what about the BBC? And the lady sitting next to me, who was British, said, well, that's the British Foreign Office. The BBC is anti-British Foreign Office.
Yeah. Yes.
2 points, especially relating to Great Britain, but also Jewish anti-Semitism here. One, the quarrel within the Anglican Church between the deists and those who have replacement theology, and the Bishop of Guildford, for one example, or in the United States, Ted Shaw of Massachusetts, for another example, where the success of Israel gives the deists within the Anglican Church an argument against the replacement theology people. So the replacement theology people have a motive for what is happening in their support of it. The second thing, Jewish anti-Semitism. Here in Israel, and also the Jewish left in England and Great Britain, the fall of communism, and indeed socialism too, as a philosophy. Who do you blame? Your own people.
Last 2 people. Thank you.
A few years ago,
Please stand up so that they can hear.
a few years ago, a book was published with the same title as this evening's session, New Anti-Semitism. And one of the virtues of the book was that it gave a very broad spectrum of opinion from, we would say, from the far right to the far left. And reading the whole book, I felt that I got a balanced picture, which is exactly what I missed this evening.
Mm-hmm.
The 2 speakers making a very extreme case on one side. And I would even say that our distinguished speakers this evening have the Ory Davis syndrome, 2 Britons, Britain bashing. So we're supposed, since they're insiders, we should take their opinion as fact. I have friends in Britain, and one is a graduate student, one is a professor, both in London, both secular Jews, very Jewish Jews, and I asked them about their experiences of anti-Semitism today. And they said nobody can miss them as Jews, but they have no day-to-day experience of anti-Semitism. As for boycotts, Jews have also historically initiated boycotts against the Soviet Union, against Nazi Germany. There was also it's a boycott against the boycott doesn't have to be against the state of Israel. It can be against Israeli politics. So we also mix things up, and if we do it, we have to accept it from other parties as a legitimate.
Yes. No, thank you. I think that you have every right to stress points of balance that maybe one can't cope with in a symposium of this particular kind, and call for perhaps, certainly call for greater discussion. Incidentally, the book you mentioned, Professor Wistrich happens to have been one of the contributors to that volume. Yeah. The last person, please.
I'm just hoping I misheard the point from the other side, but I'm a representative of the British Embassy and the Foreign Office, and just to stress that the BBC does not speak for the British government at all. And if you have any points, please come and talk.
Yes, thank you very much for that comment. Well, now I think we have to draw to a close, and I would only ask whether the two participants in the symposium feel they would like to briefly say something. Please, from where you are, perhaps you can. If that's working, then.
If it doesn't, I think you. Can you hear me? It's okay. Can you hear me now? Switched on. Hello? Yes? It's okay? Fine. Just a couple of comments on pure anti-Semitism. Unfortunately today, the reality is for many children going to Jewish day school in England, particularly when they have to be bussed in and they go on the trains, they do experience severe anti-Semitism. This is a fact of life, more so, and it's increasing. Children who go to JFS, the Jewish Free School, which is now in Kenton, they are experiencing anti-Semitism. Another word about Ken Livingstone, apart from the fact that he endorses everything that Sheikh Qaradawi says, and apart from the fact that he insulted a Jewish journalist, I think we have to recognize that one of the problems we're confronting today is that it's easy to say anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, but if you look at it, why is Israel picked out alone to be constantly bashed? And in a world where you are constantly bashing Israel, whether it is in the United Nations or in various countries, inevitably this leads to anti-Semitism. Why do we not talk about the abuses being carried out today in Darfur, for example? Why did no one make a big fuss? Why did we not make a big fuss about the 800,000 killed in Rwanda a few years ago? I don't think we are saying, any of us, I'm not saying, that it is wrong to criticize the government of Israel. That is not what I call contributes towards anti-Semitism. What I do think is difficult, and the reality is that Israel is picked out alone to be constantly bashed and isolated, over and above all the other countries that are carrying out far worse abuse. That's what I feel.
A number of rather astonishing points were made here, which I'd like to briefly respond to. First of all, the gentleman who referred to the book about Judeophobia, that was the title, in Britain in the early 21st century, in which I participated. I don't think that you'll find anything in that book that is fundamentally contradictory to or different from the propositions that we'll put here tonight. I think what has happened is that appeared in 2001 or 2. In the meantime, a lot of water has passed under the bridge. The truth that was depicted in that book is even more the case today, and you seem to be totally divorced from reality when you talk about, in such a glib fashion, about there being no anti-Semitism in Britain. You simply don't know what you're talking about. No, everything you said, I'm sorry, was so inaccurate that I don't know where to begin. I really don't feel like deconstructing the absurdity of what you said. I'm sorry to be a little impolite here, but that's the way I feel about it.
That's not what I said.
I heard very well what you said. You said that this evening was a case of bashing Britain. Nothing is further from the truth. Nothing is further from the truth. There was not a single statement made, either by myself or by Brenda, that could be construed, except in a perverse way, as an attempt to bash Britain. That is a gross distortion which unfortunately reflects on the accuracy of your statements. Now, a second thing, which has already been corrected by the lady from the British Embassy. Of course, it is absurd to say that the British Broadcasting Corporation is an arm of the Foreign Office. We might perhaps say that the BBC World Service has some connections, but even over the Iraq War, the BBC landed in very heavy water with the British government. And in fact, there were occasions in which the broadcast to British soldiers was simply cut off because it was considered to be damaging to morale of British troops. It's never been the case, even though it is a state organization. But that works out in a different way in Britain. It's not a state-directed organization in the way that, let's say, French television to a certain degree is. I would also say, regarding the British government, that some reference was indeed made to it. You cannot say that the British government was anti-Semitic in the 20th century, either as a generalization or even in specific periods. You can certainly make the case, and it's been made in the literature, about Britain's conduct in World War II regarding the rescue of the Jews of Europe. And that has been very well documented with all the failures and the ambiguities and the element of anti-Semitism that also played a role. Equally, vis-à-vis Palestine, it's clear. In cases such as Bevin, which we didn't go into, a case could be made. So Bevin was also anti-Semitic in addition to the strategic, realpolitik, imperial policy considerations that determined his views on Palestine. And there are other periods of time, but you can't talk about anti-Semitism. Britain has been generated by the government. And I can tell you from having had several discussions with high-ranking British officials and MPs, that they have a very clear understanding of the seriousness of this problem, much clearer than what was suggested in one or two comments. They don't necessarily understand it, but they are aware that there is a problem, and there's no attempt to run away from it or to indulge in escapism. And on the whole, I think that the British government has been better than the civil society and public opinion shaped by the media and the academic and other elites. One historical comment, because allusion was made to Winston Churchill, who is obviously a very remarkable and special case. The article in question is an extraordinary article from 1920, where you feel that Churchill is wrestling even within himself between what we could loosely call a philo and an anti-Semitic demons. And Zionism appears in that article as the solution to the divided soul of the Jewish people. Bolshevism is the demonic side, and Zionism is the constructive Jewish activity, which is the only possible answer to the tendency of Jews that Churchill believed in, to that if it was not properly channeled, would go in the direction of revolution, unrest, chaos, a widely held view both in the class and the milieu in which Churchill moved. But being the great man that he was able to overcome even such prejudices which could have turned him along a different path.
Well, on that Churchillian note, we will draw to a close. Thank you.